This is the story of Azariah the prophet, a man whose words weren't always welcome, but who chose to speak truth anyway because he feared God more than people. Prophets may not be popular, but their words bring life when obeyed. Once upon a time, when kings rode chariots and nations trusted in swords, there lived a prophet named Azariah, son of Oded. He had never worn a crown, never held a weapon, never led an army. But when he spoke, even mountains seemed to listen. People said his eyes could see past a man's face and straight into his motives. He wasn't loud or dramatic, just steady, like the hush before a storm. And what made Azariah different from other prophets was this: he didn't speak unless God burned the words onto his heart like fire on stone. He lived alone, outside the city walls, in a small stone house wrapped in ivy and silence. He grew figs, crushed olives for oil, and spent hours in prayer. Not the kind of prayer with fancy words, but the kind that listens more than it talks. He didn't need crowds. He didn't seek power. All he ever wanted was to obey the voice of the Lord. But there was one man Azariah kept watching from a distance, King Asa of Judah. Azariah had seen Asa grow up, a cautious boy who stood beside his father's throne, barely speaking. He remembered the way Asa had once wept when he saw idols torn down. He remembered a younger Asa kneeling in the temple courtyard long after the priests had gone to bed. He wants to do what's right, Azariah often muttered to himself. But there's fear in him too, fear of men. And now that fear was growing. Azariah could sense it. Lately, rumors had crept through the valleys like smoke. Rumors of Asa building alliances, of the people returning to their old gods in secret, of the king growing more proud and less prayerful. And worse than all of that, war was coming. Azariah stood on the ridge above the valley of Zephathah, arms folded against the cold wind, watching Asa's army gather like ants across the plain, 10,000 strong. Yet the enemy outnumbered them nearly 100 to 1. He stared into the distance, past the campfires and tents, to the hills where the Ethiopian army was said to be marching, and deep in his chest, that familiar burning stirred. Now, he whispered aloud. The answer wasn't in words, it was weight, a heaviness that wrapped around his ribs like a command. He took a breath. Very well, Azariah said softly. I will go. He adjusted the strap on his rough cloak and began walking down the ridge toward the man he had watched for years, toward a king on the edge of fear, and toward a moment that would test the heart of a nation. The prophet wasn't popular, but the word of the Lord was rising in him like dawn, and the kingdom was about to hear it. This is the story of Azariah the prophet, a man whose words weren't always welcome, but who chose to speak truth anyway because he feared God more than people. Biblical lesson: prophets may not be popular, but their words bring life when obeyed. Once upon a time, in a land where kings built towers but forgot who built the stars, there lived a man named Azariah. The wind howled through the cedar trees on the ridge above the valley of Zephathah. It was a lonely place full of rocks and twisting vines, but Azariah liked it that way. He sat cross-legged on the hillside, wrapped in a worn wool cloak, watching the distant dust clouds churn in the sky. Battle was coming. He could feel it in his bones. A small bird landed near his sandal, chirped once, then flew off again. Azariah whispered, "Even the sparrows know when to flee." Behind him, the groan of an old tree echoed like a sigh. He turned his head, half expecting someone to be there, but the grove was empty, just wind and shadows. Still he spoke aloud as if to someone invisible. "You told me to wait. I've waited. Now what, Lord?" He stood slowly, brushing dust from his cloak. His back ached, and his knees cracked, but he wasn't an old man yet, just a tired one. Then it happened. Like a surge of light behind his eyes, a fire deep in his chest that wasn't from food or fever. The voice inside him wasn't loud, but it burned clear. "Go to the king. Speak to Asa." Azariah closed his eyes. "I knew you were going to say that. Tell him, the Lord is with you when you are with him." He groaned. He's not going to like this. Kings never like reminders. Still, his feet moved before his mind agreed. That was the way it worked with prophets. Obedience first, comfort later. By the time he reached the edge of the valley, he could see the first line of soldiers sharpening spears and stacking shields. Asa's army, 10,000 strong, and they looked nervous. Good. They should be. 1,000,000 men from Ethiopia were gathering on the other side of the plain. Azariah marched past the soldiers like a man who belonged. Some recognized him. Others just stared. He didn't care. He was looking for one person. King Asa stood near a tent made of embroidered blue cloth, studying maps on a stone slab. He wore iron armor that looked too heavy for his frame. His eyes darted to Azariah the moment he approached. "You," Asa said, blinking. "I've seen you before." Azariah nodded. "Yes. I saw you once, when you were still young, kneeling beside your father's bed. You prayed for wisdom back then." The king's jaw tightened. "And you're here now. Why?" Azariah's voice was quiet, but firm. "Because God sent me." Several guards shifted, gripping their swords. Azariah didn't blink. "Listen carefully, Asa. This is not my message, it's his. The Lord is with you while you are with him. If you seek him, he will be found by you, but if you forsake him, he will forsake you." A gust of wind swept through the camp. The blue tent flapped. No one said a word. Asa looked down at his hands. "You came to warn me before the battle." "I came to remind you," Azariah replied. "The battle isn't yours. It never was. But whether God fights for you, that part is up to you." Silence again. Then Asa stepped back, hands falling to his sides. "Then stay. Speak to the men. Pray with them. If your God is with us, we'll listen." Azariah gave a small smile. "I'll speak to them. But don't say your God, Asa. He's our God, or he was. It's time to return." And just like that, a ripple of hope moved through the camp. Azariah the prophet, dusty and weathered, began to walk among the soldiers, speaking not with the booming voice of command, but with the quiet weight of truth. And wherever he spoke, hearts were steadied, eyes cleared. Men who had doubted now stood tall. No one cheered, but the silence became holy. The prophet wasn't popular, but his words, oh, his words brought life. And the battle hadn't even started yet. The sun climbed higher over the hills, burning away the morning mist as Azariah stepped into the valley. His sandals pressed into dry grass, the blades crackling beneath him. Down below, the army of Judah buzzed like a restless hive. Clangs of iron, shouts of captains, the snorting of horses. Soldiers paced and polished their shields, trying to look braver than they felt. Azariah walked right into it all, without a sword, without armor, just a staff in his hand and a word from God on his tongue. No one stopped him. Some recognized him. Whispers followed him like wind. That's the prophet, Oded's son, the one who speaks with thunder in his voice. Others just stared at the wild-eyed man in the threadbare cloak moving straight toward the royal tent like he belonged there. He did. King Asa stood beneath a linen canopy embroidered with the crest of Judah, a roaring golden lion, and leaned over a stone table studying a carved map. Beside him, generals barked orders and drew lines in the dust with sticks, planning where to station archers and how to protect the flanks. Azariah didn't wait for an invitation. He cleared his throat, loudly. All eyes turned. Asa looked up slowly. "Azariah?" he said, blinking in surprise. The prophet's face was calm. "Yes, my king." "What are you doing here?" Asa asked, straightening. "There's a battle coming." "I know," Azariah said. "That's why I came." Asa gave a tired laugh. "If you're here to bring bad news, you can turn around." "I didn't come with bad news," Azariah said. "I came with a reminder." He stepped closer, voice quiet but firm. "The Lord is with you, Asa, when you are with him." The word struck like an arrow. Several generals looked away. One coughed nervously. Azariah continued, "If you seek him, you will find him. But if you turn away, he will turn away from you. You stand on the edge of a great victory or a disaster, and the difference isn't numbers, it's obedience." A hush fell. Even the breeze seemed to pause. Asa's hand twitched. "You think I've turned away?" Azariah didn't flinch. "Not fully, but you're leaning. And leaning becomes falling if you don't stop." The king stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, Asa bowed his head. "You're right," he said quietly. "I've been afraid. We've made alliances. We've let altars crumble and idols slip back into the shadows, but no more." He looked up, fire in his eyes now. "You've reminded me who wins battles?" Azariah smiled. "It's never the biggest army. It's always the one with God in front." King Asa turned to his men. "Gather the priests, call the people. We will seek the Lord before we seek the sword." And so it began. As the drums of war echoed in the distance, Judah did something strange. They paused. In the middle of a war camp, with enemies just beyond the ridge, they worshipped. Azariah stood in the center of it all, arms lifted to the sky, the prophet who reminded a king where his true strength came from. And somewhere far off, in the hills still hidden by haze, the enemy marched forward, completely unaware that they weren't just facing soldiers. They were about to face a nation that had just remembered their God. Trumpets echoed across the valley like lightning splitting the sky, but they weren't signals of war, they were signals of worship. Azariah stood barefoot in the center of the makeshift gathering place, surrounded by soldiers who had set down their weapons and raised their hands instead. Armor clinked beside lifted voices. Even the campfires seemed to glow brighter as the name of the Lord rolled across the land like thunder. King Asa knelt in front of the altar they had built from rough stones. No gold, no decorations, just fire and faith. He raised both hands as the priest sang, and his voice rang out clear and strong. "Lord, there is no one like you to help the powerless against the mighty. We rely on you." A wind swept through the camp, warm and wild. Azariah whispered, "He's listening." Behind him, a soldier wiped tears from his dusty face. Another dropped to his knees, gripping his sword tighter, not out of fear, but out of trust. The sound of marching grew louder in the distance, thousands upon thousands of Ethiopian warriors moving like a tide toward the valley floor. Drums beat in the hills. The enemy was close. Asa rose to his feet. His voice was calm now, deeper somehow. "Men of Judah," he called out, "you are not just soldiers. You are sons of the living God, and we do not fight for power. We fight to defend his name." A cheer erupted, not wild or frenzied, but steady, rooted, real. Azariah stepped beside the king. "Are you ready?" Asa looked at him. "I am now." Then the trumpet sounded again, this time for battle. But the men of Judah didn't charge in fear. They moved like people who had already won. Azariah didn't pick up a sword. He walked alongside the army with his staff in hand and the word of God burning inside him. As the two armies collided in the valley, chaos roared like a storm. But something strange happened. The enemy began to falter, like their strength had leaked from their bones. Some dropped their weapons. Others ran before a single arrow flew. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't strength. It was something unseen, something holy. Azariah stood on a rock, arms stretched wide, as he watched the impossible unfold. A small army pushing back a massive force. A young soldier raced past, grinning. "It's working! Prophet, it's working!" Azariah smiled, but didn't shout. He just whispered, "When God goes before you, there's no such thing as impossible." He knew this battle would end in victory. But the real test would come after the dust settled. Because the hardest part wasn't winning a war. It was staying faithful when peace returned. The sun sank low over the hills, casting golden light across the valley floor. Where once there had been fear and fury, now there was quiet. Bodies of shields lay scattered, abandoned by the enemy in their retreat. Judah had won, not by skill, not by numbers, but by surrendering to the one who fights for the faithful. Azariah stood at the edge of the battlefield, silent. His robe fluttered in the breeze, torn at the hem but soaked in purpose. He closed his eyes and took a long breath. The Lord had done exactly what he promised. Behind him, Asa approached on horseback. His armor was scratched, his face streaked with dust, but his eyes were alive. "You saw it, didn't you?" Asa said, sliding off the horse. "You saw it before it even happened." "I saw it," Azariah replied, "because God showed me your heart before he showed me the battle." Asa walked slowly beside him. "You were right. All of it. We had drifted. We let the idols creep back in. But I won't forget again." Azariah turned, fixing him with a look that was both kind and sharp. "See that you don't. Victory has a way of making men forget who gave it to them." Asa nodded slowly. "Then help me remember." And so, over the next weeks, something rare happened in Judah, something not even Azariah had fully expected. The king didn't return to his throne and pat himself on the back. He tore down every idol in the land. Not just the obvious ones in the public places, but even the hidden ones buried in groves and behind walls. He cleansed the land from north to south. And the people followed him, not out of fear, but out of conviction. One night, as the stars lit the sky, Asa called a great assembly in Jerusalem, not just warriors. Everyone, children, elders, farmers, foreigners, who had come to live among them. A massive altar was built, not out of gold, but out of stone, rough and real. Azariah stood before the crowd, holding up his staff as silence fell. "The Lord is not impressed with your strength," he said. He is not moved by your numbers. But when he finds hearts that are fully his, he shows up. The people shouted in agreement, trumpets blared, offerings were given, and the whole nation entered into a covenant, not just with each other, but with the God who had delivered them. Azariah's voice rang out one more time. Do not seek him only when you are afraid. Seek him when you are strong, especially then. And from that day forward, the prophet became not just a messenger, but a guardian of the soul of Judah. He walked beside the king. He taught the people. He reminded them again and again. Victory is a gift, but faithfulness is a choice. Years passed, and for a time, Judah flourished. Crops grew tall in the fields. Laughter filled the streets. The sound of hammers echoed from the temple walls as repairs were made, and new worship songs rose like incense into the air. People came from distant lands just to see a kingdom ruled by a king who actually listened to God. Azariah walked the roads between villages like a shepherd without sheep. He carried no banner, just a staff and a listening ear. Wherever he went, people greeted him with respect, not because he was rich or powerful, but because they remembered what had happened when he spoke. One afternoon, Azariah sat beneath a fig tree outside a small town called Maresha. Children played nearby, shouting and chasing chickens. A woman passed by with a basket of bread and called to him, "Are you the prophet who helped win the war?" Azariah chuckled. "No," he said, breaking off a piece of the bread she handed him. "God won the war. I just reminded a king." The woman smiled. "Still, we haven't forgotten. Thank you." As she walked off, Azariah sighed and leaned back against the tree. It was good. Everything was good. Too good. That evening, as the sun melted into the hills, Azariah sat by his fire. He stared into the flames, listening to the crackle of wood and the quiet whisper in his heart. Peace is a gift, but don't let it make you sleepy. He straightened. "Are you warning me, Lord?" The fire popped, sparks dancing upward. The answer came without sound, but it filled his bones. "Watch the king." Azariah's heart sank. He had watched Asa grow into a man of prayer, a ruler of justice, a breaker of idols. But now, he hadn't seen Asa in months. The king had stopped calling for counsel. He stayed in the palace, behind thick walls and thicker pride. Azariah packed his things before the fire died out. "I'm going to see him," he muttered, "before comfort turns into compromise." By the time he reached Jerusalem, things had changed. The gates were still open, but the people inside moved quickly and kept their heads down. Gold adorned the palace doors, but the joy in the streets had dimmed. Something was off, like the kingdom was holding its breath. Azariah approached the guards. "I need to speak to the king." The men looked at each other. He doesn't see visitors these days," one said. Azariah's eyes narrowed. "Then tell him this. The prophet who walked beside him in battle has returned, and he has a question." The guard hesitated, then turned and vanished into the palace. Azariah waited. He prayed. He prepared himself. Because he could already feel it. Something in Asa had changed. And when a king stops listening, the real danger begins. The guard returned at last, his voice tight. "The king says, 'You may enter, but only briefly.'" Azariah nodded. "That's all the time God needs." He stepped into the palace halls where the scent of cedar and incense filled the air, but it didn't smell like worship anymore. It smelled like comfort, like a place where questions weren't welcome. Two soldiers opened a pair of tall doors, and there sat Asa. His robes were fine linen. Rings sparkled on his fingers. He leaned against an ivory chair with a look that tried to be friendly, but didn't quite reach his eyes. Azariah bowed slightly. "King Asa." The king gave a tight smile. "Azariah, it's been some time." "Too long," the prophet said gently. "I heard you stopped calling for counsel." Asa's face darkened a little. "I've been busy. There's peace in the land now. We don't need prophets like we used to." Azariah stepped forward. "You always need prophets, especially when things are peaceful." Asa stood, pacing. "We have strong walls now, armies trained and ready, treasure in the storehouses, no need for panic." "I'm not here to panic you," Azariah said. "I'm here to warn you." The king turned, frowning. "Warn me? About what?" "About pride," the prophet answered. "It doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it hides in success." Asa clenched his jaw. "Is that what this is about? A lecture? After all I've done?" Azariah's voice remained calm. "You tore down idols once. You trusted the Lord in battle, but now you lean on alliances with other kings. You made a treaty with Ben-Hadad of Aram instead of seeking God. That's not leadership. That's fear in royal clothing." Asa's hand slammed against the table. "Enough!" The echo rang through the room like a struck bell. Azariah didn't flinch. "I don't say this to shame you," he said. "I say it because I remember who you used to be, and I still believe you could be that man again." But Asa's face was hard now. "You come here after years to insult me?" "I came here to remind you," Azariah replied quietly. "The eyes of the Lord search the whole earth to strengthen those whose hearts are fully His. Asa, don't let your heart drift." Silence. Long and heavy. Then Asa waved a hand. "Guards, take him out. I don't need this. Not from him." Azariah lowered his eyes and turned without argument, but just before the doors closed behind him, he said softly, "Prophets may not be popular, but their words bring life when obeyed." And with that, he was gone. But the words stayed behind, like a seed dropped into dry ground, waiting to grow. Azariah stepped out of the palace and into the fading light of evening. The sky burned orange behind the hills, but inside the prophet's heart, the glow had dimmed. He walked through the streets of Jerusalem with his head bowed. The city was still beautiful, lamps being lit, children chasing goats through alleys, musicians playing soft notes near the gates. But something deeper was missing. Azariah could feel it. "They forgot," he whispered. "They forgot what it felt like when God fought for them." He passed a wall where ivy grew wild, twisting around a cracked carving of a lion, Judah's symbol. The carving looked tired. "I said what you told me to say," Azariah said, gazing up. He didn't listen. The breeze blew gently. "He heard you," the Lord seemed to say. "Whether he listens is his choice. Your job is to speak." Azariah nodded and kept walking. Back at his quiet home outside the city, the prophet lit a small oil lamp and sat beside it, writing down everything that had happened. He always wrote down God's words, every prophecy, every conversation, every warning. He believed someone someday would need to read them again. But miles away, inside the palace, Asa paced alone. The room was silent, but Azariah's voice echoed in his mind. The eyes of the Lord search the whole earth to strengthen those whose hearts are fully His. He sat on his bed, ran a hand over his beard, and frowned. "What does he know?" he muttered. "I've built walls. I've trained armies. I've secured peace." But another voice whispered in his heart, "Did you build the walls, or did God give you the time to build them?" He stood abruptly, as if trying to shake the thought. But no matter how many times he poured wine or changed rooms, the words clung to him like a second cloak. Days passed, then weeks, and Asa grew more restless. He began ordering strange things: harsh taxes, new checkpoints at city gates, tighter control over the priests. The people noticed. They whispered. Some remembered Azariah. Some even traveled out to his home to ask for advice. Azariah welcomed them with bread and honest words. "We can't make the king listen," one farmer said. "What do we do?" "Stay faithful," Azariah answered. "You don't need a crown to obey the Lord." "Will Asa return to God?" a young girl asked. Azariah looked into the fire. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But God hasn't turned away from him. Not yet." And in the quiet of that evening, the prophet prayed, not for justice, not for power, but for mercy. Because deep down, he still believed Asa could come back. But the road back to God would cost the king more than he expected. The seasons turned. Wheat fields waved golden in the sun. Grapes ripened on the vines. On the surface, Judah still looked strong, but underneath, something was breaking. King Asa rarely left the palace now. His orders came through messengers. His face disappeared from public gatherings. Whispers started spreading like wind through dry grass. "He's not the same king we followed into battle. I heard he imprisoned a prophet for speaking against his alliance with Aram." "Do you think God is angry?" Azariah heard it all, and he felt the ache of it, every word, every sigh. He stood on a ridge one morning, watching smoke from the palace kitchens rise into the sky, and he prayed aloud. "Lord, I spoke when you said speak. I stepped back when you said wait. But how long will Asa wander before he sees?" The wind rustled the trees, but no clear answer came. Back in the city, Asa's heart had grown hard, not just toward prophets, but even toward God himself. He trusted doctors over prayer, counselors over conviction. Then came the wound. It started small, just a pain in his foot. Nothing serious, but it spread. It worsened. And instead of calling for a priest or humbling himself before God, Asa called physicians from distant lands. They treated him with powders and oils. They gave him expensive ointments and chants in foreign tongues. But the wound didn't heal, it grew. One night, as thunder rolled in the distance, Asa sat alone on his bed, his foot wrapped in linen, swollen and burning. He reached for a goblet, grimaced in pain, and nearly knocked it over. Then across the room he noticed something strange. A scroll, old, dusty, still sealed. He limped toward it, breathing heavily, then cracked it open. It was a record, written years ago by his scribes. Words from Azariah, the ones spoken before the great battle. "The Lord is with you while you are with him. If you seek him, he will be found. But if you forsake him, he will forsake you." Asa stared at the scroll for a long time. Then, instead of falling to his knees, he rolled it back up and set it aside. He couldn't let go of his pride, not even now. And in the hills outside the city, as another storm rolled in, Azariah opened his window to the thunder and whispered, "He still won't listen." Then he blew out the lamp and sat in the dark, waiting. Because prophets don't stop hoping, even when kings stop hearing. Rain came hard that night. It pounded the rooftops and flooded the narrow streets. The fields drank deeply, but the city trembled, not from the storm, but from what the people were whispering. King Asa won't leave his chambers. They say the pain is worse. I think God's trying to get his attention. In the dark, people remembered the prophet, the one who had spoken truth during the last storm of fear. And once again, sandals made quiet paths to Azariah's door. A merchant arrived first, then a teacher, then a young boy with wide eyes and a question bigger than his voice. Is the king going to die? Azariah knelt down and looked the child in the eyes. "I don't know," he said, "but I know what can bring healing." "What?" "Repentance." The boy frowned. "What's that?" Azariah smiled. "It means turning around, admitting you went the wrong way, and deciding to go back the way you came." The boy blinked. "Like when I take the wrong path home and have to go back past the big goat?" "Exactly," Azariah said, chuckling softly. "Even kings have to turn back sometimes." That night, Azariah lit a fire and sat beside it, watching the flames dance. The people who had gathered sat around him, listening to old stories of Moses, of David, of prophets who were ignored and prophets who were obeyed. "But what if he never turns back?" someone asked. Azariah looked up. His eyes sparkled in the firelight, tired but steady. "Then we stay faithful, even if the king does not." Meanwhile, in the palace, Asa tossed and turned in agony. The pain had reached his knees. His hands shook. His pride, once thick as a wall, now cracked around the edges. But he still wouldn't call for Azariah, still wouldn't bend. He stared at the ceiling, breath ragged, and muttered, "I built this kingdom. I led us through war. I made peace." But the voice inside him said something else. "You didn't." "I did." He clenched his fists. "I won't beg for help. I'm the king." And somewhere outside the city, under the stars, the prophet whispered into the night, "Then the wound will remain. Because sometimes the deepest pain isn't in the body. It's in the heart that refuses to kneel." 3 years passed, and still the king would not bend. His feet were twisted and raw. The pain was constant, pulsing like a drum that never stopped. But his pride was louder. Even when his servants begged him to call for Azariah, Asa refused. "I don't need a prophet. I need physicians," he snapped. But the treatments failed. And the kingdom changed, not with fire or invasion, but with silence. The people noticed the shift. The joy that once spilled through the streets had dried up. The music in the temple grew quieter, the children played less, and though no one said it aloud, many began to feel it in their bones. The king had turned away from God. But not everyone had. In a small village near Hebron, a woman taught her sons the words of Azariah. In a town by the Jordan River, a farmer carved the prophet's message into his fence post. "The Lord is with you when you are with him." And high in the hills, near the place where Azariah first spoke to Asa, people gathered, not in crowds, but in twos and threes. not to hear new words, but to remember the old ones. Azariah didn't demand their attention. He didn't travel with guards or wear special robes. He just walked. He prayed. He listened. He spoke when the Lord gave him something to say. And everywhere he went, the people asked the same question, why hasn't Asa repented? Azariah never pretended to know everything, but he always gave the same answer. Because repentance is like a locked door. God has the key, but only if the king asks him to turn it. One evening, as Azariah sat near a stream watching the water slip over stones, a messenger approached. Young, pale, breathless. "Prophet," the boy gasped. It's the king. He's worse." Azariah nodded slowly. "I know," he said. "Will you go to him?" the boy asked. The prophet looked toward the horizon, where the palace roof shimmered in the distance. "If he calls for me, I will go." "But what if he doesn't?" Azariah's voice was steady. "Then I will still pray for him, because my loyalty isn't to applause, it's to truth." He dipped his hand into the stream and let the cold water run through his fingers. "Some people change at the edge of death," he said softly. "But others cling to pride until their very last breath." The wind rustled the trees, and for a moment it sounded like the whisper of a door still waiting to be opened. The palace grew quiet, too quiet. Even the servants walked softer now. Curtains were drawn over the high windows, and guards stood still as statues, not out of duty, but out of sorrow. Everyone knew the king was dying, but no one could say it out loud. Behind the heavy doors of the royal chamber, Asa lay on a bed carved from cedar and gold, wrapped in fine linens. His crown sat on a table beside him, untouched. His eyes were dim. His breath came in shallow bursts. His feet were swollen and dark, covered in cloths that had been changed a dozen times. Nothing worked, not the potions, not the ointments, not the physicians who had come and gone in nervous silence. He was surrounded by comfort, yet deeply alone. One night, when the stars blinked overhead and the palace had fallen into a hush, Asa opened his eyes and whispered to no one in particular, "Did I win, or did I just last longer than my enemies?" No one answered, not the guards, not the healers, not even God, because God was waiting, still, patient. But Asa's heart had grown tired of waiting. He closed his eyes again, haunted not by pain, but by memory, the prophet, the voice, the words. "The Lord is with you when you are with him, but if you forsake him, he will forsake you." He turned his face to the wall, but far outside the palace, under a sky brushed with silver clouds, Azariah stood on the hillside again, alone, except for the whisper of the trees and the glow of the stars. He had not been summoned, but he still prayed. "Kneel, Asa," Azariah whispered into the night. "Just kneel. He's still listening." A breeze stirred. Down in the valley, faint torchlight flickered along the road to Jerusalem. A line of villagers was walking toward the temple. They carried no offerings, no sacrifices, just faith. One woman carried her newborn son. Another held the hand of an aging father. All of them walked in silence, hoping that if the king would not repent, they still could. Inside the palace, Asa's breathing slowed. He opened his mouth once more, barely a whisper. "Azariah!" But no one heard it. And the prophet never came. Because the door had never been opened, and the key had never been asked for. Morning came with no trumpet, no announcement, Just a heavy stillness that draped itself over Jerusalem like fog. Birds sang, as they always did. Markets stirred. But in the palace, servants moved slowly. Faces were pale. Voices were whispers. King Asa had died. No cries echoed through the halls, no last-minute repentance, no final blessing to the people. He passed the way he had lived in his final years, closed off, surrounded by riches, but sealed in silence. News spread like ink in water. "He's gone," someone muttered. "Did he call for the prophet?" another asked. The answer was always the same. No. But out beyond the city, Azariah already knew. He had felt it, like the sudden silence of a forest before a storm. He stood at the edge of a wheat field, eyes fixed on the horizon, his hands folded around his staff. He whispered, "So it ends." A boy from the village ran up, out of breath. "Prophet, the king has died." Azariah nodded once. "I know." The boy looked confused. "What happens now?" Azariah turned to him, face calm but heavy with truth. "Now the kingdom must decide who it will be without him." Later that day, people gathered outside the palace gates. Priests stood in solemn robes. Officials spoke of Asa's victories, his reforms, the great battle he had once won, the peace he helped secure. They spoke of everything, except the ending. Azariah didn't attend the ceremony. Instead, he walked through the villages, speaking softly with those who would listen. "To begin strong is good," he told a group seated around a fire, "but to finish faithful is better." "But why didn't he listen?" someone asked. "He used to be so different." Azariah closed his eyes for a moment, then answered, "Pride can grow quietly, like a vine. At first it seems small, but if left alone, it can cover everything, even the truth." Another voice, young, trembling, asked, "Is it too late for us?" Azariah's eyes opened, sharp with light. "Number not for you. Asa's story is finished. Yours is still being written." He stood and lifted his staff. "So write it well. Listen quickly. Kneel often. And never forget, the Lord is with you when you are with him." The wind swept through the hills. Somewhere beyond, a new king would soon rise. And while Asa's legacy had become a warning, Azariah's voice remained, calling not just rulers, but everyone to stay close to the only king who never fades. It didn't take long for Judah to crown a new king. His name was Jehoshaphat. He was Asa's son, young, sharp-minded, and more observant than most people realized. Though raised in the palace, Jehoshaphat had often slipped out to hear the stories people told in the streets. He remembered the prayers before the great battle. He remembered the day Azariah had spoken fire into the heart of the nation. And most of all, he remembered his father's final years, how the light in the palace dimmed, even as the gold on the walls shined brighter. On the day of his coronation, Jehoshaphat looked out over the people from the palace steps and said, "My father gave us peace, but we will not stop at peace. We will seek God." The crowd erupted, but Azariah, watching from a nearby rooftop, didn't cheer. He watched the young king with careful eyes, searching not for charm, but for conviction. "Will he follow fully?" Azariah whispered to the wind, "or only halfway?" That evening, a knock came at the prophet's door. It was a royal messenger, nervous, young. "Prophet Azariah," he stammered, "King Jehoshaphat requests your presence, not for rebuke, but for counsel." Azariah raised a brow. A king requesting advice, not just accepting it. That was new. He stepped into the torch-lit hall of the palace that night, passing servants and guards who recognized him but didn't dare speak. They remembered the last time Azariah walked these halls, and how the king at the time had sent him away. But Jehoshaphat stood waiting, alone, no crown on his head, no throne behind him, just a simple robe and a question in his eyes. "Will you help me, Azariah?" he asked. "I want to lead well. I want to finish better than my father did." The prophet studied him. "You'll need more than desire," Azariah said. "You'll need courage to stay close to God when comfort tries to pull you away." Jehoshaphat nodded. "Then stay with me. Teach me." Azariah stepped forward, eyes steady, voice low. "I will walk beside you, as long as you walk with God." And just like that, a new partnership began. But this time, the soil was softer, the ears were open. The king wasn't just tolerating the prophet, he was welcoming him. And Azariah, now older, slower, and a little more tired, felt something stir in his soul: hope. Because though Asa had closed the door, his son had just flung it wide open. The story of Azariah the prophet concludes as one legacy ends in silence, but another begins with surrender, proving that obedience always plants seeds for the future. Years passed, and this time they were good ones. Jehoshaphat ruled with justice. He sent teachers across the land to read the scriptures in every town. He tore down the shrines his father had allowed to stay. And he made one thing clear from the very start: Judah would not forget the Lord again. And everywhere the king went, Azariah walked quietly beside him. Not to shout warnings, not to correct or confront, but to encourage. In his older years, Azariah's voice grew softer, but somehow more powerful. He didn't need volume. He had presence. Villagers still gathered when he passed by. Soldiers still paused to listen when he spoke. Even children ran to him, not in fear, but in trust. "Tell us the story again," they would say, "about when Judah won the war." Azariah would sit beneath an olive tree, his old staff across his lap, and begin like he always did. "Judah didn't win the war. God did. But first, we had to stop trusting ourselves." He would pause and look at the children, eyes twinkling. And the king had to listen to a prophet, even when it wasn't easy. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the air turned gold, Jehoshaphat sat beside Azariah on a hillside overlooking the temple. "I want to finish well," the king said, "like you've taught me." Azariah smiled. "Then keep listening, not to me, but to him." Jehoshaphat nodded. "I will." The prophet placed a hand on the king's shoulder. "Your father had strong beginnings, but he feared looking weak. Don't fear weakness, Jehoshaphat. Fear forgetting God." They sat in silence after that, letting the breeze carry the wisdom into the wind. That night, Azariah returned to his small home, the same one wrapped in ivy and silence. He wrote his final words in the scrolls he had kept for decades. "The Lord is with you when you are with him. If you seek him, he will be found. But if you forsake him, he will forsake you." Then he laid down, and sometime between the hush of night and the break of dawn, the prophet went home. Not to his stone house, but to his eternal one. There was no grand funeral, no statues were carved, no parade was held, but in Judah hearts remembered. And in the king's court, one sentence was written into the law. Listen to the voice of the Lord like Asa once did, and may we never stop listening. Because prophets may not be popular, but when their words are obeyed, they don't just change kings, they change generations.